So we can start with the traditional introduction to the Dhamma talk. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, the title that today's talk inherited is Dukkha is the spiritual disease. Just to be cheerful about things. The way these talks go, the Sunday talks, it's been sort of a little tradition that's developed over the years within the community, which is comes from Ajahn Jayanto giving these Sunday talks for so many years, and yet he doesn't know. He just feels he just comes and he talks on Dhamma, the same thing every time, or variations on the same theme. So he asked us to come up with titles because people seem to like titles. And we have this little ritual where a couple months before the summer, the nuns and the monks, we get together and think up little clever titles for talks and make a big list and then present them to, it used to be Lumpur, this year it was Ajahn Amaro, and they'll pick the titles that seem interesting and then come and talk whatever they want to talk about. So I was actually quite happy to see that the talk that I'd inherited was the sort of negative, sour, Theravadan one. And Dukkha is the spiritual disease. Rather than, it could be, we are all love and light, and the world is made of jelly beans. Or something more, not to dismiss a positive approach to spiritual, the way that we orient ourselves towards spiritual work, because that's what it's all about, isn't it? It's about how we approach something which is an important capacity, an important possibility for all of us, each one of us, as a human being. And then the words that we use then are just ways to help us orient ourselves towards that path. And sometimes more sort of so-called positive phrases are useful, more useful for individuals, and sometimes actually looking at the stuff that we don't want to look at, and just sort of being realistic about our situation, one might say, is more useful for more individuals. And the Theravada approach, the southern Buddhist tradition found in Thailand and Laos, Cambodia, Burma, the sort of old school, has been known throughout the centuries, even blamed throughout the centuries for being a little bit sort of dour, looking at this whole business of our lives, our life as a human being, and what has meaning, and what happiness is, what freedom means, where it comes from, that whole business, how to frame it. Theravada has often talked about what the path is not. The Buddha would often say, well, it's not this, and it's not that, and it's not the other thing. And you'll find it if you refrain from doing this, and stop doing that, and stop doing the other thing. So the sort of Buddhist scriptures then come across as a lot of no's, don'ts, nots. And it can be a little depressing sometimes, perhaps, especially if we're coming, without really knowing anything about this whole, the possibilities of the human heart and the work that we each can do. And the Buddha, so the title of the talk, then, Dukkha is the spiritual disease. Dukkha, for those of you who, I assume people are familiar enough, for people coming today, but in case you're not, with the Buddhist teaching, that dukkha is the word often translated as suffering, but really suffering, the English word is not adequate. translation, because it's not just the kind of unpleasant feelings and sensations and situations that we would normally associate with suffering, but it's just any kind of dis-ease. So actually the word disease in the title is very appropriate too. It's not just the unpleasantness that we suffer with, it's also the kind of suffering that we have when things go well, when we have happiness, when there's joy, when things go right, when we get what we want, or when others get what they want, and that makes us happy. Because if we're not careful, and the Buddha was here to tell us how we can be careful, if we're not careful, then we can suffer even with that, even when things go right. Because when we're happy, if we really look closely, we'll often find that there's part of us which is wanting to, or needing to, protect that happiness. How do I maintain this? How do I make sure it doesn't disappear? And just that tension of the insecurity of not knowing when things are going to change and not having the control to make things the way we want, even when things are going well, that in itself it's a seed of suffering. It's actually some dukkha which is in the present moment. And then of course, because things do change, they don't stay the same, we can't control them. Then if we are looking towards the happiness of in the usual sense for our peace and for our security, then when they do change, our peace and our security, our sense of happiness changes too, because the two are linked. We're trying to get happiness from the feelings of happiness, rather than that kind of happiness that the Buddha tried to point us to, which is maybe happiness with a capital H, a sort of true or spiritual happiness, which is the happiness of not needing to feel happy at all. And that might sound pretty confusing to some people. But perhaps, with a little of practice, and those of us who've been doing some practice over the years, we've got tastes of this, is when we start to realize the happiness of peace with things, peace with ourselves, peace with what we're experiencing as they are, peace with things as they are, even though they might not be the way we want them. In fact, they're almost always not the way we want them. And yet we can be peaceful with them. Now, does that mean we need to agree with what's going on? No, it's not talking about agreeing with or disagreeing with or saying, yes, what's happening is right, because sometimes what's happening is not right. What's happening is wrong. But the whole right and wrong, as long as we're caught in that duality of trying to make things right, we are going to suffer. And it's not an easy thing to look at for any of us. There are all kinds of very understandable hesitations around that too. Well, what happens, if I just accept things as they are, then, people will just run ramshot over me and the rest of the world. All the evildoers will get what they want, and the right people will just accept it all, and we can't do that. It's irresponsible. That's how it feels. And there are some valid points in there, and so we have to be really careful about what we're doing, what we're not doing when we manage this. But really what the Buddha was talking about was, as an experiential reality, just right now, in any particular moment, how are we with what's happening now? How are we with this? It's not dictating what we have to do, what we don't do. We can still act in a way to try to avoid, negative repercussions or to do the right thing. But it's how are we doing that action? Are we doing it with the insecurity of feeling that we can't be peaceful, we won't be happy, suffering will happen unless I fix this? Or can we come to a place of peace in ourselves first, actually with things as they are now, and then from that place one still acts? And that's really, in terms of the relationship with the rest of the world, in classic Buddhist practice, classic Theravada approach, that would be what we're focusing on, is that really our actions in terms of how much we can help others, and too, how much we can help ourselves, is limited to the degree of our own wisdom in these matters, of how much we're attached to getting a particular result and how much we're attached to certain feelings that are arising. So dukkha is the spiritual disease, and the Buddha did approach the whole business of teaching by framing the spiritual problem, the sort of existential lot that we find ourselves landed in. He framed it in terms of a disease too. When he first taught the first teachings, the Dhammacakka Pavattana Sutta, the teachings of the Four Noble Truths, to his 5 former disciples, who became his first 5 disciples once he gave them this teaching. It was, in a sense, in the framework of a medical cure. The first noble truth being the diagnosis, there is dukkha, there is suffering. We have to realize this. The second noble truth, that dukkha is caused by craving or attachment. That's the cure, the cause rather. So the diagnosis, the cause, and then the cure, the kind of that's possible. That it is possible for dukkha to cease. The third noble truth, and then the fourth noble truth. Well, the remedy, the path to the cessation of suffering. And again, not the cessation of feeling anything unpleasant. Our lives are always going to be full of the pleasant and the unpleasant. This is part of human life. And so that's really, that first noble truth is just a matter of recognizing that, of stopping, just not going along with any illusions we might understandably be treating ourselves to about life, but just looking at things as they are. And it's not talking about suffering in the sense of 40,000, African children starving in Africa, which is a horrible thought, and it's something that we can really have empathy for when we hear about these things, and we think, my gosh, think of that. Well, I'm not suffering. Look at me. I've got a computer, and I watch TV, and I've got plenty of food on the table, and I think about this, but I'm not suffering. They're suffering. It's not suffering in that sense. It's not comparing our suffering with somebody else's suffering. And it's not, again, about unpleasant circumstances. It's about, is there peace in the heart now? Or is there some even subtle sense of stress or dis-ease? So that's the suffering that the Buddha said, if we can solve this one, we'll be in a much, much more clear and powerful place to help, the world, as they say. And there's, of course, always only going to be limited effects that we can have on the world. Each one of us is going to have a different set of circumstances which may or may not limit us in how much we can affect those around us and the society and so on. But all of us have the capacity not to suffer. And this is the good news of Buddhism, the sort of jewel in the negative message of life is suffering, which is the sort of dour Theravadan image that you have. I mean, you could say, life is wonderful. We are beings of light. We can go, when I traveled through California, Berkeley, in the late 80s, after having discovered some of Buddhism in Asia, and it was very much like that. It was like, stop thinking any negative thought. Just visualize yourself as you wish yourself to be. And all of us are essentially beings of love and truth and light, and if we can just get on the same wavelength and some variation of this theme. And I'm not trying to put that down, because it may, in some circumstances, be a skillful means, a skillful way to affect a mind which is caught in negativity and doesn't even see it. But it doesn't necessarily really look at things as they are in a way that is useful to us when we finally come to the point of, okay, how do we really free ourselves from that which is pushing and pulling me throughout my life? And that is the basic forces that all of us can recognize in ourselves and in others, which the Buddha pointed to. It's the force of lobha, or you could say greed, but it's not just greed, it's that basic wanting, trying to have, trying to get, to bring in, to pull in. Or dosa, aversion, hatred, or not wanting, the basic pushing out. I want, I don't want. And moha, so the delusion of being fooled, fooling ourselves, not consciously, but just seeing through a filter, which, it's not a judgment. It's not saying, that we're wrong for doing that. It's just what happens when we're all caught in this difficult situation, which is life. So the First Noble Truth is like coming out of denial, just recognizing, right, okay, yeah, people are beautiful, I'm a being of light, but life is suffering. There is suffering. Just recognizing right now there is suffering. It's not having an idea of myself, getting a Theravada Buddhist idea of, we are all suffering, it is all suffering, I am suffering. Then we'll just make ourselves miserable. So it's not about getting an idea of ourselves, it's about tuning in on an experiential level to what is happening right now, in this moment, here and now. Is there complete freedom? And if we're able to cultivate an awareness which can see without being filtered through our views and through our perceptions, which we've adopted from others and taken on ourselves over the years, if we can just come into contact in a raw way with our awareness and with what's happening now, our bodies and minds, how we experience this moment, then it starts to make more sense, this sort of teaching that the Buddha is giving. It starts to, this dis-ease or holding on, this attachment, this not being able to stop trying to get what I want and trying to get away from what I don't want. Or even if we're not there yet, starting to see that that's painful. Maybe we don't even think, well, maybe we're not at that point. Maybe we think, well, what's wrong with trying to get what I want and not having what I don't want? That's natural, isn't it? And it is natural. So it's, again, not a value judgment. It's not saying we're wrong for doing any of this. It's totally understandable, and it's what all beings are generally doing, animals as well. We want what we want, and we don't want what we don't want. And yet, the Buddha's message, if we want to actually recognize that we're suffering from a dis-ease, is to see that for what it is, not to fool ourselves about it. Come out of denial. First Noble Truth. Ah, yes. Okay, all the other stuff, sure, but there is suffering. And then we become interested in, well, how does that, is it just inevitable? Do I just have to suffer and I'll just have to make my life into the best that I can make it? And generally I think, maybe even without being so conscious about it, a lot of us are doing that anyway. Is just we presume that there's no real greater freedom possible than the little, or maybe the large, tastes of happiness that we've had when things go well. And so we just try to arrange our lives as best we can so that we get as much of the happy stuff and as little of the unhappy stuff. And that's very reasonable, and it's not wrong. And yet the Buddha was saying there's more, and it's good news. There is actually true happiness. Happiness with a capital H is a possibility. And he also said this is a teaching for those with little dust in their eyes. So it's like not necessarily the case that all of us are going to be at a point in our lives where we can recognize this possibility. And sometimes it takes some serious suffering of the unpleasant kind to even start to question in a way in our own lives, to bring us to look at our life in this way and see that there's some value here. And other times people, for whatever reasons, just have more of a capacity or less of a capacity to recognize it. But if we can, the Buddha said, if we can recognize that there is a path, there is another way, a third way, a middle way, not just trying to get happiness and trying to avoid unhappiness, but there's a third way which leads to a true, real peace and happiness. If we can recognize that that is a real possibility, well, it's a very valuable thing. A very, very valuable thing. And it's something we can, if we give importance to, then it becomes something we're interested in. And once we're interested in it, well, okay, how do we tread this path? Is there a cause? And so the cause of dukkha has very much to do then with these basic forces. I want, I don't want, and just not seeing things in a wrong way, or not seeing things for what they are, so that we're constantly getting caught in the same patterns over and over again. And many of us who have been doing this for a long time know that it's not necessarily the case that once we see what we're doing, once we see how we're making ourselves suffer, that we can then stop. It doesn't necessarily solve the problem. So sometimes, I might see that, okay, wow, I actually have the chance to be completely free in this moment. I don't have to wait for the monastery to be perfect. I don't have to find the perfect teacher who will finally, open his arms and say, you've come now. This is what you do. And, I don't have to find the perfect situation. We don't have to have the perfect family lives where everyone finally is happy and secure, and whatever it is for each of us, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, we don't actually have to find that pot of gold. We're already rich. It's in here. So, okay, how to do it? And we start to see, okay, yes, if I just let go a little bit around that wish to, get the right kind of food and avoid the wrong kind of food, and then maybe I'll finally feel better. Just let go, just be at peace, just be at ease, just, okay, right now it's like this. Maybe it still feels bad because it's not the right kind of food, but that's not the point. The point is how I'm making myself suffer with this situation. So, okay, right, yes, indigestion, wrong kind of food. But I don't have to get myself all upset about this. I can actually be peaceful with this unpleasant sensation. Now that's interesting. I thought peace had to be a pleasant sensation. But that's not the kind of happiness that we're talking about. It's a peace, it's not fighting this moment. It's being with this moment in a new kind of way. And then suddenly, right. What a revelation. Then we get really interested in practice, perhaps. And we want to just throw everything away, just give our families to somebody else and join the monastery. And hopefully soon we see through that enthusiastic wish. Because what you quickly find is the next day comes along and you think, great, I've learned it now, I'm not going to suffer. And before we know it, why, chilly again. And then you catch yourself, hey, I learned this yesterday. And you realize it's not enough to see what's happening once and then say, right, okay, me, stop. It doesn't work that way. We're caught. It's a pattern. It's like seeing that your hand's in the fire. I've used this image before with some of you who've been to my retreat. But it's like, okay, I'm hot. Where's the heat? Looking for a way, maybe it's him, maybe it's her, maybe it's the government, maybe it's this and that. Then you see, I've got my hand in the fire. No. All I have to do is pull it out. Right, okay. Pull it out. Come on. And you find that your hand is atrophied. Or so then you got to do the things of learn to meditate and get the joint all oiled up so you can really pull your hand out of the fire. And then you do it. You think, great, wonderful. You feel some coolness. And that's a really valuable thing. It's not something to dismiss at all. You feel the coolness of the peace that the Buddha's pointing to. And then you look this way and you come back and there's your hand again. And so it's a matter of just again and again patiently doing something which is essentially very simple, in the sense that it's not complicated, it's not complex, but it's not easy. So simple but not easy. And so it's a matter of how important is it to me, because this is going to take some work. And in fact, for each of us, it's going to take a real commitment. which is why we have things like monasteries, and those of us who choose to live a monastic life, that's a lot of it, if not all of it. How do we help ourselves do this? What's going to be supportive? And let me just check as I go on. This little ringing here, is that bothering anybody, or do you think it's okay? Everybody can hear okay? All right, we'll leave the ringing. We won't suffer with the ringing. So the ringing is unpleasant sensation in this, and I could get myself upset about it if I wanted to. I could think, so-and-so and so-and-so asked me for a recording of this talk after it's given, and this ringing is probably going to keep them from doing so. And it's probably just one button on that machine over there that gets adjusted a little bit, and yet if I stop talking, these people will lose their attention, and so I'd better keep talking. And as I talk about the peace of being at ease with conditions, here I am suffering about this ringing that's going on as I speak. You see? The hand is still in the fire all of these years. So we have to know how do I see what's going on? And that's why you hear a lot about meditation. In Buddhism, it's always about awareness. Awareness, 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 awareness. Especially in this tradition, talking about awareness all the time. Or mindfulness. Or whatever word the teacher tends to use. And that's why, though. It's because how do we see what's happening? That's really what the Buddha is interested in helping us do. As the first step, but an essential and profound step which can take us all the way through. Appamado, or heedfulness, is the way to freedom, is the way to the end of suffering. So just being heedful, knowing what's going on. It's simple again, but it's not easy. So then meditation is a way we just train ourselves to be attentive to what's happening. And it sounds very simple. Well, it's simple, but it sounds very easy, but it's not easy, is it? We sit down, we try to watch our breath. And then 50 minutes later the bell rings and we think, oh yeah. Or, 10 minutes later we think, oh, right. Because we've been caught again in our habits of drifting away. And that's interesting too. That's like the first step. We just realize we might think that we're very mindful, aware, Buddhist, spiritual people, perhaps more spiritual than the co-workers that are around us because we practice Buddhism and we know about awareness and they're not even interested in it. And so we might have these ideas about ourselves, and then we sit down to meditate and we think, I can't even follow 3 breaths. What's happening? But that's all right, because that's the first step for all of us. We just see how things are. And the fact is, no matter what our view about ourselves is, the reality is always different than our view. And so wisdom is to know that in a way in the heart, where we're not even just telling ourselves that, but we know it in a way where we see it eventually. We see that the views that we have about ourselves, about the world, they're not wrong, and they're still going to be there, but they're not true. We can only trust them 50%, really, if that. They're approximations. And if we try to believe them 100%, we are going to suffer. So seeing the capacity that I have to have a perception about myself and the world, seeing that for what it is one of the goals of awareness. And on the path of this path of peace, the Buddha was interested in offering to each of us, really an important landmark, just to start to see how the way that I see myself, the way that I see the world, is not true. It's we don't have to, we'll still believe the beliefs that we have, we'll still have the perceptions we have, we don't have to stop all that, but it's an approximation. There's always an element of not sure, of don't know, of okay, but. And that becomes less threatening the more we start to cultivate awareness in meditation, and then really through the way that we live our lives as Buddhist practitioners, because meditation becomes eventually something that's not just when we sit down on the cushion and follow the breath or do whatever we're doing when we meditate formally, but meditation becomes a word that we talk about what we're doing with the mind, and the mind is always with us, or the heart-mind. We're not talking about the brain when I say mind, but you could say the heart, or you could say the mind. It's that which knows, that in us, which feels, which knows, cognizes. That's always there. It's not just there when we meditate, obviously. And so meditation then becomes how we cultivate that. Once we start to recognize this sense of watching ourselves as we meditate, watching our breath, repeating a word, or noticing when we suffer, that which is watching, that in us which can recognize this, that becomes something that's a little bit more tangible, something in itself which is of great value. And it's always there. It's not just there when I sit down cross-legged and meditate. It's there right now as I speak. And when we're in conversation with people that we know, or walking down the street, or any time at all, that we choose to remember, there is that quality of awareness, of being aware. And once we start to rely on that more, and on our views and perceptions less, then to see our views and perceptions for what they are, as relative approximations, becomes much less threatening. And that can be a gift not only that we give to ourselves, but certainly we give to the rest of the world. Because if we really look at many of the problems in the world, between individuals, between groups of people, between nations, a lot of it has to do with the attachment to beliefs, belief systems, and views, beliefs, opinions, and the certainty that seems to come from that of, I'm right, and if only, we get everybody else to come along this way, then there'll be whatever it is, happiness or no suffering, or, the gross national product will be in the right percentile, or whatever people are thinking about. But they're attached to this view, and if we start to cultivate for ourselves an awareness of how our views are not to be trusted, and they're not to be totally dismissed. They're necessary navigational tools as we live our lives. Even the Buddhist view, is a set of ideas that we adopt, and we can use it skillfully, we can use them skillfully, or we could use them unskillfully. We can become fundamentalist Buddhists, proselytizing on every street corner, saying, if you don't keep the 5 precepts, you're going to the Vici hell. And the Buddha told us not to do this. In fact, the monks and nuns aren't allowed to do this. Unless somebody asks us, we're not allowed to talk about Buddhism. But there are fundamentalist Buddhists out there, just as there are fundamentalist other things. And it's not just religions or religionists. It's, there's the communists and the capitalists and the many different ists and isms. So Buddhism, the Buddha's solution to this was not to try to change other people before we are able to change ourselves with all this. And it's such a big task that we need support in this. And that's what a monastery is about. That's why it's open to all. It's not a closed and cloistered place. And it's very much about, yes, supporting individuals, the monks and the nuns here, to practice through the various means that we have, the supports that we're given in our tradition, and that includes solitude, it includes renunciation of various kinds. But also, very much so, it's about a kind of spiritual friendship, or kalyana mitta, or communal support, and the relationship with those who are also practicing, and with those who have maybe practiced for longer than we have, so can recognize quicker than we can that we might be fooling ourselves or going off a little in one direction or another. And this is extremely valuable, because even once we do see the path and we see, right, okay, this is what I need to do, not just get what I want and get rid of what I don't want, make my life into the way I want it to be, I'm just going to endlessly suffer if I do that. Now I can see, I can put all that effort down, just put down the project of my life and be with myself as I am, even if we see that, if we don't have other people that we're relating to in this effort, we can be caught in the same sort of pattern for many, 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 many years without realizing it. So it's really useful, valuable, and the Buddha would say almost necessary, for most of us at least, to have the relationship, the sangha, support of spiritual community. So that is one thing that we're doing if we're practicing ourselves. If you're worried, because some people are, when we come to this, we can have different kinds of worries. And one very valid worry is that, well, look, if I focus on myself like all this, aren't I abandoning those 40,000 starving Ethiopian children? And, the people right next door, who, if they're right next door, well, maybe there's something I can do right now. Or the people up in Scotland, or nothing's happening up in Scotland. In Tottenham, there was a riot in Tottenham last night. It's endless if we look. And I'm sure we've all seen this and felt the kind of overwhelm that can come from reading the news and wondering, how can I help? It never ends. And that's not a dismissive statement, it's just recognizing, wow, this is what we're all caught in. And we're all, as they say in the Buddhist world, brothers and sisters in suffering. And that again sounds like a negative statement, a depressing observation to make. Why can't we be brothers and sisters in love and light? Well, we're that too. But we're brothers and sisters in suffering. If we recognize that part of it, then it's possible to feel empathy and compassion for each other, because we realize that he's suffering too. She's suffering too, just as I'm suffering. Even the perpetrators of heinous acts are themselves also caught in a web of suffering, which is going to bring even more suffering on themselves and others. All of us are suffering, and we're all in this together. So if we start to look at dukkha as being the spiritual disease, it's something which doesn't just help me, us as individuals. It helps others as well, because one, we start to stop doing the kinds of things that reinforce the patterns that we're all doing, which keep this whole thing going. Wanting, not wanting, wanting, not wanting. And just stopping doing that creates a force in the immediate surroundings, at least, if not in the greater world. But at least those that we're having immediate contact with, it creates an example and a different kind of energetic resonance, than that kind of just being caught acting on automatic pilot, which is how most of us are going most of the time, and most of the world is acting most of the time. And that's why perhaps the Buddha called it going against the stream. And it's not easy. We have to go against the usual stream, the stream of habit, and the stream that most people, most of us, we're just on, doing what we, getting what we want, not getting what we're not, trying to get away from what we don't want. Not necessarily in a selfish way. It can be very unselfish too. Maybe what we want is for the suffering to help others, and we want their suffering to stop. And we're trying to get that. And what we don't want is to be selfish and to be greedy myself. We try to get away from that, and that is a very useful, valuable spiritual effort, and should not be abandoned. And yet, the Buddha is interested in how are we with the doing of that, because and we've probably each, many of us at least, have seen examples of this. You can see if even those individuals and organizations filled with individuals who really want to help the world and doing wonderful things on a social level, they can often fall prey to exactly the same kinds of forces of division and conflict and burnout and suffering that much less selfless organizations and countries, nations, communities fall into, because we're all human. People can go into an effort very idealistically, and the ideals are perfect. They are wonderful. There's nothing wrong with them. And yet, if we don't do this kind of work, well, we'll fall prey to the same kind of selfishness, which is just latent in each of us until we uproot it. The same kind of conflicts that come through trying to get what I want. We don't think of it that roughly, perhaps. But if we really look at the energy, it's a raw, primitive energy. Lobha. Even the Pali word sounds like it. Lobha. I want. Dosa. Get away. And moha. Just not seeing. So the 5 precepts then are part of this. And I won't go into them all. But those of you who've been around for a long time know, this path can't be separated from a life where we're living with integrity towards ourselves and others. And so what the precepts are about, again, they're framed in the Theravadan Buddhist way of don't do this and don't do that and refrain from doing that. But it's actually recognizing that if we stop obstructing the heart by doing things which harm ourselves or others, if we refrain from doing these things which harm ourselves or others, like killing, taking life, or stealing, taking that which is not given, or lying, exaggerating, using harsh and abusive speech, hurting people through speech, or becoming losing our consciousness, really, because that's not so bad in itself, but because that tends to then open the doors to all the other 4 starting to happen. So getting drunk and doing drugs that we lose ourselves in, and then the other 4 come in, and before we know it, we've hurt people ourselves. If we stop doing that, then we stop obstructing a natural base kind of happiness that comes with a balanced human heart. And that is necessary. It's a necessary foundation for this kind of work. Because if we're really going to cultivate the kind of awareness that can encompass all that we're experiencing, all that comes in my life as I live it, whether I'm sitting or speaking or acting with others, the mind has to be very still. It has to be not necessarily, the kind of powerful stillness that we can attain through intense concentration, but the sort of stillness which comes from having abandoned, having renounced, having put down the effort to go with what we want and get away from what we don't want on a more and more subtle level. And if we're feeling remorse, as the heart will feel, whether we think we do or not, our hearts, being human, we will feel remorse. Maybe it's deeply buried under there and we're numb to it over actions that hurt ourselves or others. As long as that remorse is there, it will cloud the awareness. We won't be able to. There'll be a certain point where that has to be addressed. So that sort of how we live in the world with ourselves, with others, according to the so-called moral precepts, is very much an integral part of this path of awareness and the cure, the remedy for the disease of dukkha. So there's recognizing there is dukkha. There is suffering. And that's not just the kind of suffering which is unpleasant, sensation or feeling. It's also the kind of suffering which comes from, getting what we want, finally, having, happiness. So it's not putting any of that down. It's not saying, don't have any of that happiness. That can be a mistake. Sometimes Theravadins are liable to make, too. You can just become a really sour person that just doesn't want to admit or have any happiness at all because you think happiness is suffering. The Buddha said attachment to happiness is suffering. And so you just keep yourself miserable, which is more suffering than you would be feeling if you just allowed what's there to be there. And if it's happiness, well, it's happiness. And enjoy it if you can enjoy it without attaching to it in a clingy way. And that's the trick. So it can be really, it is really good to have a range of experiences, the suffering and the happiness on that level, so that we can see, can I not suffer with this suffering? Can I not suffer with this happiness? It's really tricky. It's really hard. We get to see where there's deep attachment. And that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing when we see that. We start to see it because before it was there, but we didn't see it. Okay. So giving ourselves space, yes, right? I am suffering. And can I not suffer around that? And there's this story, that it's the adding to part of the suffering that we're really looking at. The story that I like to tell, because it affected me a lot, as a great image for this, from Lumpur Sumedho when he was in the monastery in Thailand. After he'd been a samanera for a year, he'd spent his first year all alone, meditating and getting all kinds of very pleasant states of meditation. Because he was all alone, no one was bothering him. And after the first few months of unadulterated misery, he said, he then had just bliss, pure bliss. And he remembered that when he went to Ajahn Chah's monastery the following year, which was a monastery where Ajahn Chah was teaching in a different way. You had to adapt and just do what you had to do within the midst of the community. And there was not just sitting in meditation, there was working, a lot of working. There was, get up in the morning, and then you had to, it's like 2:45 a.m. you're getting up, and then you have to get there to the chanting, and then you sit on the cold with your bare shoulder exposed with the wind blowing on the cement with no cushion, and it goes on, and I'm sure those of you who've been here have heard this many, many times from Lumpur and others of us. But the main thing was this sweeping in the afternoon, and I can relate to this. I just couldn't understand. I avoided the forest monasteries. For the first year I went to Thailand, I have to confess, because of things like this. Like, why, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when it's hot and dusty, every forest monastery, you have to start sweeping the forest. I mean, it's a forest. And they want you to sweep it with brooms. And so you've been making the brooms yourself beforehand, so there's more work. And then you get up and you sweep the forest. And it's dusty because it's dusty, so there's dust around, and you're perspiring, and it's catching in your and then it's not even logical the way they do it over there. You won't say, I couldn't understand. I went and I thought, okay, there's 27 monks here, and we've got this area to sweep, so you should go there, you go there, you go there, I'll take care of this corner. But no, that's not the way they do it. It's just like one big organic blob that moves together, sweeping in a big cloud, this corner moving over to that corner, and then around to here, and you just have to surrender to it. Otherwise, you will suffer. And it was a moment of this that Lumpur talks about when he got the message of where is the suffering, which is when he was really putting himself through a miserable time, adapting to this. He couldn't speak the language, and he was sweeping the path. Everyone was sweeping the path. Ajahn Chah was there. And he was thinking, why do we have to do this? We're here to meditate. We give up all this. We have to come. Last year, if we just meditate, last year I was so happy. I was really getting somewhere. Now my mind is a mess, and here I am sweeping. And Ajahn Chah just came over and with a big smile and said, "Oh, Sumedho, Wat Pong is a lot of suffering, isn't it?" It's the name of the monastery. This monastery is a lot of suffering, isn't it? And he smiled and he walked away. And he got it. The message was, where's the suffering? Is it in the sweeping? Is it in the broom? Is it in the dust? Where's the suffering? And he realized what he was doing to himself. And we've all seen this at times, perhaps. He's working himself up. Actually, sweeping is quite a peaceful thing to do. It's quite nice. There's a little breeze often, and by 3 o'clock, and it's a quiet forest. And the noise is in my mind. Why do I have to do this? Why do they all go on? Actually, if I just relax, swish, swish, it's quite peaceful. And even the dust isn't so bad. And then afterwards we get to take a shower, and it makes the shower even nicer. The shower, by the way, is an ice-cold thing that from a bucket that you've taken from a pail in a well, and you've carried with kerosene cylinders over there because the Ajahn Chah wouldn't allow any plumbing in. But that's the point. It's like, okay, there is unpleasant sensation, but that's not dukkha. That's the disease that the Buddha was pointing to. The dukkha that is the spiritual disease is that what am I doing with this? How am I with what's happening? I'm making myself suffer with what's happening. We can't control, the vicissitudes of life, the fortune and misfortune. And the Buddha pointed to what he called the 8 worldly winds that all of us are subject to, gain and loss, and praise and blame, fame and disrepute, and pleasure and unpleasure, whatever unpleasure is. Pain, pleasure and pain. And all of us have this, the 8 worldly winds. And so it's really a matter of, can you be peaceful? For the one who's practiced the path, then it's not the one who's managed to arrange his or her life so that it's all praise, pleasure. No. Praise, pleasure. How come I can't think of the ones that... Fame, that's it. Fame, praise, pleasure, gain. That's right, gain. I think I'm getting Alzheimer's disease. So it's not just getting all those things and avoiding all the 4 that we don't like. The successful practitioner on the path is the one who's just as perfectly peaceful with pain as he is with pleasure, with loss, as she is with gain, as... Yes, you get the idea. I'll bring a little piece of paper next time. Yes, yeah. So that's the thing, It's like, and then... So is it selfish? Well, no, because it doesn't say anything about how we're acting with others, except that we're more aware of when we hurt others, because we're more aware of when we hurt ourselves. The awareness is allowed, we can trust ourselves to be more keenly sensitive and aware, in a way which will inevitably benefit those around us and the world around us. It'll create a different pattern. And that's really what the world needs, isn't it? It's what we need as individuals, perhaps. This is all for us to discover for ourselves, not to trust the Buddha, not to trust me, but just to find, listen and see, does it make sense, and then discover for ourselves. True, not true, how much of it, maybe. But it will, from the way I see things, it's really the most radical type of social action. This sort of seemingly self-focused navel-gazing of the Theravada spiritual path, looking at, your suffering, and going into a monastery and doing retreats and closing your eyes, and all of that can be seen quite validly, from my perspective, as the most radical type of social action. Radical in the sense of the words. Radical meaning going to the root. Radical. The root of the problem. So we don't just treat the symptoms, which is this particular conflict or that particular conflict, but we treat the root, which is something all of us are subject to, not just the ones we're angry at now in government or here or there, but also ourselves, is that as long as we're a slave to I want and I don't want, then we're going to be subject to creating suffering for ourselves and others. And so freeing ourselves from that is really going to the root. And it's something that, we know from the example of the Buddha and the Buddha's disciples over the years, the monks and nuns and lay women and lay men who've practiced over the years, that that practice doesn't just affect them as individuals. It's affected us, even here, now. It affects many, many people in a way which is truly beneficial. So with those words, and with the arrival of Lada's chai, or whatever it might be today, I will end the talk, and there will be a period, I guess, is it usually 20 minutes? Somebody tell me who's been here before. 20 minutes of a break for 2